Hi, and welcome back to Neon Liberalism, a weekly podcast where we try to take the issues of the day and put them in a larger historical and theoretical context. And this week, I want to talk about something kind of abstract, but kind of important. And I think a good place to get into this is with a quote from J.D. Vance, the current Vice President of the United States. And during his acceptance speech at the 2024 Republican National Convention, he had something to say about America. And he says, one of the things that you hear people say sometimes is that America is an idea, but America is not an idea. It is a group of people with a shared history and a common future. It is, in short, a nation. And this theme, it's not just Vance. You can see it running all over Republican politics today, that they reject this idea that America has these higher aspirations. They think America is a people, and they're actually quite particular about the people in question. And this underlies a lot of what we're seeing from their immigration policies. I think in a lot of ways, their immigration policies are downstream of this much deeper philosophical point about America. And so to try and understand what's happening in America today, where Republicans are coming from, and what maybe we can do about it, I want to talk about this deeper question: what is America? So I'm very excited to have Guillaume Attia on the podcast today to talk about this. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, Guillaume, you recently wrote an essay for us at Liberal Currents, the fixed theme of American history. And I was wondering if you could, like, what's the 5 minute or the 5 second, the elevator pitch for your essay here?
Yeah, I think when I talk about the 16, it's this juggling act between freedom and coercion. Uh, Throughout the American history, there have been forces within society that have tried to extend the dominion of um, liberal ideas throughout the American nation, and there have been counter forces that have tried to restrict this vision. And so you can see it playing out throughout all the major events in American history, whether it be the Revolution, Civil War, the era of Reconstruction, all the way down to the 20th century with the First and Second World Wars. And I essentially try to convey in this article that one of the most important aspects of American ideals is this idea of equality. And that it is a very radical idea of equality, and the reactionary forces in American society have tried at various points in history to um, either completely erase this ideal, forget it, or reevaluate this ideal. But it has been the main driver of egalitarian politics in the United States. And at the current stage we're at in American history, it seems to be, again, an attempt to kind of um, either reconstrue this idea of American equality or to ignore it altogether. So I think this is where we're at in this political moment. Yeah. Again, I think it's really about this notion of equality. Equality is really the radical idea in American political tradition, and it's really the idea that is most upsetting to reactionary forces in the United States.
Yeah, I think that's right. These are like deep questions about what America stands for, what equality stands for. Sometimes on the right, you'll see them talk about regime politics. This
Mm-hmm.
is especially in people who are coming out of the Claremont Institute, coming out of the
Yeah.
Straussian tradition.
Yeah.
Um, and can you tell us a little bit about what they think regime politics is?
Again, there's a broad range of understanding about how to think about equality here. And fundamentally, they are nationalist. That's one of the kind of operating principles of the right. And for nationalists, the primary concern is, of course, the nation, and specifically a concrete people. And so for them, they have to then specify what kind of people they idealize. And oftentimes we find that, as I mentioned in the article, Steve Bannon mentions the Puritans, the descendants of the Puritans, and the Pilgrims. But someone like J.D. Vance, for example, is, of course, married to a person of Indian descent. And so for him, his story is an adjustment to the traditional story that says that this is, strictly speaking, um, uh, a kind of white ethnic conception of America, and it's very awkward if you hear him talk about his his conception of nationalism. He almost has to apologize and say, I'm biased because I'm married to so and so, as though to tell his audience that this is something that is a deviation from what we would think of as the ideal way of think of oneself as an American. But fundamentally, for them, you have to focus on those who are either born in the United States or can trace their ancestry to, as J.D. Vance mentions, to generations up to the Civil War and beyond. And so, for those who have that particular heritage, there is a sense of equality that the people that are true Americans are equal to each other in their aspirations, are equal in um, the things that they value, are equal in terms of the moral value. Whereas others who perhaps fail to meet the criteria do not as much of a say, or perhaps do not get the access to the same resources, and perhaps should not even be considered as part of the polity altogether. And so I think the reaction to immigrants of various sorts, whether it be what are called quote unquote legal or immigrants, is very much an attempt to kind of identify who's the who's the foreign entity, who's alien, and who's part of the nation, properly speaking. And so, again, I think that's very much the idea that's kind of driving a lot of the current right wing thinking. It need not be, again, I hasten to mention, it need not be a strictly ethnocentric vision. One can, like I said, in J.C. Vance camps, one can incorporate people of various racial backgrounds, but there's still an emphasis on a very clear, concrete border nation as the center of moral value.
Yeah, and I think I want to ask you about that tension here, um, between, how do you even have nationalism that isn't ethnocentric? And I think part of the question here for me gets to the question of what are nations, right? And what makes a nation? Are nations something that stretches back into ancient antiquity and we can clearly identify them across cultures? um, that's one view that some nationalists seem to have, right? That our nation is very ancient, right? The German nation traces its origins back to the Battle of the
Right.
Teutoburg Forest in Roman
Yeah.
times or whatever, right? There's all these myths. But then there are arguments made by historians and political scientists who say that like national organization as a concept, as a way of organizing people, is actually quite new. Um, and this is the arguments made by people like Benedict Anderson, who
Yep.
argue that it's especially modernity mass communication, mass literacy, a mass civil service that enables this widely dispersed group of people to even think of themselves as a national community.
That's right. Hmm.
Yeah, and I guess I'm curious, like, where do you come down on these kinds of questions?
Yeah. Again, I think um, it's important to look at the way the language that is being used, because there is this proposition that one can think of the nation as an idea on the one hand, and one can think of the nation as a people. Uh, and so there's this kind of distinction that is being made. But I think one actually analyzes this distinction, one quickly realizes that this distinction is vacuous. Because for one, um, the idea that the America as a nation is kind of the figment of kind of the cosmopolitan elite, um, and that America as a concrete homeland is really what is ordinary Americans identify and relate to, um, is really a distinction that is conceptually deranged. And the reason I say that is because, as you mentioned, nation and nationhood itself is an idea. Is also as abstract as you know um, freedom, democracy, or whatever big concept you would like to invoke. Um, as you mentioned, Benedict Anderson and many other scholars have discussed the formation of this notion of the nation. And it first has to be conceived of and then implemented through constitutional meetings and then a lot of legislative work to create nations often. And oftentimes is not even necessarily intentional. Sometimes nations are formed through various accidents of history. Uh, and so it's much more complex than simply seeing it as ideal versus kind of concrete conceptions of nation. And then the second point I would like to make as well is that one need not make this very harsh distinction because even someone like Abraham Lincoln, if you remember the Gettysburg famous Gettysburg speech um, is brought forward uh, after tremendous victories on the battlefield and tremendous pressure on Abraham Lincoln to give meaning to the number of people who died during those battles. And he comes forward and provides this concession of the nation as not any kind of nation, but a liberal nation. He said that this is a nation that is dedicated to certain core proposition and conceived in liberty. And so you can have a nation that is concrete. And then Abraham Lincoln during the speech mentions the word nation at least 5 times. And so he's very insistent on this idea of the nation. But at the same time, he's also insistent on pointing out that this is a nation that was dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And so, uh, again, you can have a nation, but it can be a liberal nation, conception of the nation. And so you have to really specify which kind of nation you are talking about. And for um, current right wing thinkers, they are more hesitant to put forward this idea of the United States as a liberal nation, a nation with a credo character. And they really want to emphasize that the United States is a nation as specified by its people and by its very concrete physical space, its homeland. And so I think that's kind of um, where they want to go, but I think there are political and psychological reasons why they want to go in that direction, rather than the much more historically um, robust idea of the nation, which is that it's very much a mixture of both the ideological conception of the nation and the concrete conception of the nation.
Yeah, I think that's worth reflecting on, right? That there's whether or not you think that they're accurate or like grounded in reality, a lot of people do seem to have these sort of pseudo biological conceptions of nations, right? As like a community of people who are all in some abstract way like a people, which is to say related. And it's this kind of in a lot of ways untenable, but the pull of the idea lingers.
Hmm.
And I actually want to quote Lincoln here because I think it's kind of interesting how he resolves this tension. This is from what's sometimes called the electric chord speech. He gives this in 1858.
Hmm.
Um, and he says, "We have, besides these men, descended by blood from our ancestors, among us perhaps half our people who are not descendants at all of the founders.
Yeah.
They are men who have come from Europe, German, Irish, French, and Scandinavian, men that have come from Europe themselves, or whose ancestors have come hither and settled here, finding themselves our equals in all things. If they
Yeah.
look back through this history to trace their connection with those days by blood, they find they have none. They cannot carry themselves back into that glorious epoch of the Revolution and make themselves feel they are part of us. But when they look through that old Declaration of Independence, they find that those old men say that we hold these truths to be self evident, that all men are
That's right.
created equal, and that they feel that that moral sentiment taught in that day evidences their relation to those men, that it is the father of all moral principle in them, and that they have a right to claim it as though they were blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of the men who wrote that declaration, and so they are."
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think that's a very interesting text because he, on the one hand, is like making a very explicit endorsement of this, what you've been calling a creedal nation, that America is defined by our ideals, and in particular the ideals of the Declaration. But he includes that bit about how it's like kind of like a mystical transmutation. If you believe these things, then you are flesh of the flesh and blood of the blood of
Hmm.
our, notional ancestors, the founding
Yeah.
fathers.
Right.
And I think that's like a really interesting text because of how it kind of unites these two different ways of thinking about nations.
Yeah, and I mentioned quickly, it's also important to remember that when the Republican Party was first constituted, one of the main um, points in the platform is a direct rejection of nativism and of the nativist party, and that was of course because of again philosophical reasons. The free soy ideology really focused on the ability of anyone to really pursue this American dream, which is really described in terms of um, starting out, venturing out, and going for working for someone, and then through diligent savings and work, then being able to work independently, and then that person ends up hiring another person, and then moves on the ladder of social mobility. And that was something that German immigrants and Dutch immigrants and a whole range of people from Europe were already succeeding at very well by the time the Civil War had commenced. And so the Republican Party was not interested at all in this notion that somehow these very remarkably successful immigrants were somehow excluded for the American dream when they were contributing vitally to the republic at that point. And so, again, I think this is something also that's relevant to current politics, which is that um, you may have objections to border policy, and you may have objections to um, the say the demographic change that is happening in the United States. But one has to also ponder uh, what is owed to people who contribute to the economic flourishing of a society. And whether or not politicians have an appetite actually deny such people the ability to continue to do so, insofar as their constituents benefit from that work, and society in general benefits from that work. So I think it's really Republicans really damage their cause and go against the historic instincts when they attempt to pretty much make it hard for immigrants to come to the United States and to reproduce the kind of success that prior generations of immigrants have been able to accomplish.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there in what you said, and I want to come back to this question of immigration and successful immigration and like the many ways that it has worked in America. But to focus on some of the things you were saying earlier about equality and the ideal of
Hmm.
equality, because this is a big theme in your essay, which is that it is the Declaration specifically, and some of
Yeah,
the text Jefferson in particular is responsible for, that defines the creedal aspect of America.
yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Like, what do you think is, the creed that defines America?
So I think it's important to think about what makes the United States unique in terms of its history. And so scholars often talk about the age of revolutions. And, we have the English glorious, quote unquote, revolution. And we then have the American Revolution that often draws a lot of ideas from that era, the radical Republican era. When it comes to the establishment of rights of man, the United States is unique insofar as, in terms of its articulation of that doctrine, it is as clear and crisp as possible. That there is no way of kind of um, reinterpreting the words of Thomas Jefferson. And that is what derails the course of American history if you are a racist, because when you start talking about people being by their nature, and by virtue of being creatures of some sort of deity, whether that deity be conceived of as natural or otherwise, um, then you're starting to say that there's something about human beings as human beings that entitles them to a certain kind of moral consideration and respect. And once you say that, then you then open the door to conversations about the nature of humanity and who is very much included in that category. And John Locke here, I think, is instructive, because John Locke, as Jeremy Waldron, a legal philosopher, has spent quite a lot of time discussing. John Locke's idea of equality uh, is one that places moral personhood in reason. And oftentimes philosophers have these conversations about what makes a person worthy of moral consideration. And many kind of features that I discussed, and one of the popular ones, of course, is rationality. But Locke's idea of reason is a specifically theological idea of reason. Insofar as he says that um, so far as human beings have a basic capability to think in abstract terms, that basic capability for abstraction leads them often to a conception of God. It leads them to some sort of idea that says some sort of creator. And once that happens, that also then leads them to the idea that they have certain duties, moral duties. And that happens again, then it leads them to this idea that um, uh, they have certain obligation not only to themselves but to other human beings. And so for John Locke, being the kind of creature that is able to recognize that one is a product of some sort of divine creation, means that you're also able to recognize that you have some sort of special relation to that divine entity, and also means as well that it, other people also have that relation, and so it's impermissible for you to actually use people um, without any consideration for what for why they were placed there on earth for the for in the first place. And so Jeremy Warden has this passage where he talks about if I capture a rabbit, um, then I might treat that rabbit in certain ways. I might domesticate it, or I might decide to eat it. But if I capture a human being, then I'm dealing with the being of a different order altogether. And that means that I start to perceive that this being is also capable of abstraction and capable of recognizing that he or she is created in the image of God, and therefore that person has duties that have been laid out by this divine entity. And so I am not to interfere with that person's pursuits of those duties. And so I think it's a very complex and theological conception of equality, which basically says that, again, people are, we are one another's equals insofar as we have basic capability to reason in abstract ways, and being able to conceive that we are made in the image of God and therefore valuable, and that also we have duties not only to one another but also to God, which shouldn't be interfered by other human beings who decide to, for example, enslave us. Therefore, undermining the pursuit of the duties that have been set out by this divine entity. So this idea creates a whole range of problems if you are a slave catcher and if you're a slave owner, because then you can't easily appeal to the Bible as a justification for enslaving people. But it also means that as Thomas Jefferson said, you tremble and fear at divine judgment. If it is indeed true that these beings have been put on earth for a divine purpose, and you are by enslaving them and directing that work towards something else, basically interfering with the divine purpose that God had set in mind for them. But I seem to ask that there were a lot of people who rejected this Lockean conception of equality because, again, it was too much to handle and too difficult, theoretically at least, to accept if you were a slave owner. And so the actually preferred way of thinking about rights and equality was actually the ancient Greco-Roman idea of equality, and that is again very different from the Lockean idea, and we can perhaps go into that if you want.
Yeah, so again, there's a lot there. Obviously, there's all these philosophical debates in the Enlightenment about moral and political foundations that are kind of lurking in the background of the Declaration of Independence, right? That Jefferson is in some ways channeling these Lockean ideas. He doesn't really spell any of that out. He just starts with a very simple proposition. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it's your contention in this essay that it really mattered that he thought these things and that he put them in the Declaration of Independence, one of the founding documents, and that slave owners, not just slave owners, various slave takers, the whole slaveocracy of the South, but also other people down the course of American history who have kind of been stuck being forced to wrestle or to reject these kinds of founding ideas. And you argue that it's actually been like trouble for them, right? That it has generated real political opposition because of the contrast between these founding ideals and the kind of systems of extraction and oppression that they were involved in.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can think of Alison Stevens, the vice president of the Confederacy. He gave a famous cornerstone speech, and one of the repeated claims that he made throughout his career was that um, essentially African Americans or Negroes, as he called them back then, were constitutionally um, uh, fated for subordination. That is, in that very nature, uh, they were fit for only menial tasks and tasks that served the purposes of the masters. And he wasn't not the only person to make that claim. George Fitzhugh and many other slave defenders made that argument. And in making that argument, they explicitly rejected John Locke and rejected Thomas Jefferson because Thomas Jefferson was pretty much conveying these Enlightenment ideas of natural equality. And for them, the best way to bypass that was to simply say, look, historically speaking, it's to believe that the founders meant to include black people in a conception of equality. Uh, but even if you say so, let's say we grant you this concession, then Jefferson was simply wrong. You see, because the teachings of history and ancient history clearly show that there are certain kinds of beings that have been uh, fated for subordination. This goes back to this Greco-Roman conception of humanity. And I think it's very important that we remember this because I think we kind of take it for granted that uh, the the Greeks and the Romans, especially the Athenians, were so marvelous in advancing human excellence that we forget that slavery was everywhere in that world. I often like to remind people that Plato, in Plato's laws, which is very much an elaboration of his ideal utopian vision in the Republic. In Plato's laws, he says that the ideal society, the best morally conceived society, has artisans as slaves. Okay, so this is the idea of the best society, and it was not uncommon to refer to slaves as animals. You know, Xenophon, like to refer to them, for example, as man-footed thing. You know, just as you would refer to four-footed creatures, right? Even the Stoics, the Stoics who they had many philosophers who were actually emancipated slaves, and so they among the ancient thinkers, they were more aggressive than perhaps other schools in challenging some of the practices in Roman culture, like gladiatorial combat and also certain kinds of slavery. But Cicero, for example, he referred to uh, uh, the common masses, included slaves, as Phaeacius, which is what the word that we use for feces. And those were basically terms that were common. And the idea was that there are certain people who were called the humiliatores. It was what we conceive today as the humiliated. And that position of life was to be basically trampled on. And that's why your master was called the domini. right? Those are the people who dominated you. Um, and there's this wonderful section uh, uh, in the history of Christian values, in which the word mayo, for example, was used for Romans to refer to both the act of urinating and also the act of ejaculating. And this was very much the idea that slaves could be used as basically walking, talking lavatories. There were people that you could just basically use and as basically fluid depositories, and that was nothing more, nothing less than that. And so I think this history of the ancient world is shocking to modern ears, but it's something that is important to remember when the southern slavers were referring to Aristotle and other people. They meant to defend a very brutal conception of of dominion over people, and all of this was done very much to avoid, again, this Jeffersonian idea of equality, which basically said that no, it is not the case that nature has assigned uh, certain people to certain positions in life. That by nature, all human beings are equals, and that and for love, for example, again, uh, people have a base. No matter how. So let me step back a little bit. So, for example, the ideas was that African Americans could not reasonably be taken to be people of serious moral character or capable of excellence because fundamentally their cognitive abilities were very low. That was the idea. But what John Locke says is that if you read, for example, the reasonableness of Christianity, you find passages where he says, or his text on education, you find passages where he says that every human being has a basic capability to reason in abstract terms, and it doesn't matter how impoverished one is, doesn't matter how trampled on one is, that basic ability to reason abstract terms leads that person to a conception of God, and so on and so forth, right? And so that again is a direct challenge to the kind of um, Aristotelian idea of the natural slave, which says that the natural slave basically have to be guided by their masters because they have some sort of cognitive defect so serious that they actually can't operate on their own. And so, again, all of this to say that this Jeffersonian idea of equality is very piercing if you are someone who is trying mightily to defend a conception of human beings as being naturally dedicated to subordination. And that is
Yeah.
basically what was the conversation in the Civil War era.
Yeah, I think that's right. That there's this very ancient conception of the world as divided into natural hierarchies, right? Aristotle has this concept of the natural slave, and for the people on the top of the hierarchy, it's like, oh, we are all equals, but like there's this other class, or maybe multiple other classes of people who we're naturally suited to rule over, and they exist to be used by us, basically, right? And that's like you say, that's not a modern conception. That is an ancient conception of society that has been around for a very long time. And in many ways, ancient societies were structured on that basis. And as we get into the modern age, as we get into this Enlightenment era, we see this rejection of that to say that's none of that's true. Actually, people aren't born with saddles on their backs. Actually, there is we differ in all kinds of ways, but there's a certain basic capacity that we all have that makes us all equal. Um, and so there's that contrast, that tension, and there's been a lot of people in American history who have appealed to these ideals, right, as the basis for political organizing. right? Whether that's the radical Republicans or the abolitionists or civil rights activists, who have looked at these founding documents and said, yes, that's right, and we too are equal and belong in this community. And one retort that probably has been on listeners' minds for a little while now, and that people have made at various times, is that, well, actually, it was always hypocrisy. None of that was true, right? Jefferson owned slaves, right? He wrote the Declaration, but he owned slaves. His own children, were slaves, right? His own
Right.
flesh and blood. He did not care enough
Yeah.
about them because of his racial beliefs or whatever it was. And
You're
that,
right.
there are other examples you give in your essay, in particular about our treatment of Indians and the Indian tribes. Um, that are genocidal and horrific, and they often appeal to these ideals and were trampled on and driven out regardless. And I wonder, what's your response to this kind of worry, this kind of again, these facts of American history.
Yeah, that's a very very good concern, and I think it's something that's persistent even to this day, which is that there's this grand vision, an ideal of what America stands for, and then there's the sharp reality that is presented to our eyes, regularly. And for example, again, I like to try and make sort of conceptual distinctions here. Um, there are three major ways to think about quality, as was discussed throughout American history. There's this idea of ontological equality. There's a second idea of civil equality, and then there's this third idea of social equality. Now, the ontological equality is what we've been discussing, which is this idea of is there something, is there some sort of um, material or some sort of nature that makes human beings the same? Um, and that's a very philosophical conversation, and to this day, a lot of philosophers struggle very hard with any kind of metaphysical um, conception of how we could be the same, because it doesn't seem that there's ways to ground such a conception of equality, given what we know about natural history. Um, and then there's of course the civil equality. People say, well, let's not bicker about what makes us equal metaphysically, but let's just grant that for very practical purpose, it's important for us to be equal before the law. And oftentimes that is where a lot of the legal conversation goes on, and the disputes rage. And then there's a further discussion about, okay, grant people civil equality, then within the social realm, are people treated with respect? And you find that for someone like Abraham Lincoln, who again praises Thomas Jefferson for affirming this idea of metaphysical equality, um, when it came to civil equality, he wasn't so sure initially, and that's something important to remember historically. Um, and one of the main worries in his public life was the criticism that he was trying to uh, make it possible for African American men to intermingle with white women. There's the charge of miscegenation was very much alive, and he, early on, he very much fought this accusation and says, no, I really want to honor this ideal that we have about people being made by God in equal value. But I do not want to go so far as to suggest that a black person is my equal in every respect. And so equality can be taken to very deep waters, and oftentimes even people who were abolitionists were not clear that they wanted to go all the way to social equality. Some were some brave souls, were conceived of civil equality. I mean, part of the Reconstruction era, and what makes the Reconstruction era is that more abolitionists and willing to entertain the idea that we need to put in place certain laws to effectively render African Americans as civil equals. But even while trying to legislate for such um, laws, they were making backroom deals to see if it was possible to basically ship off African Americans back to Africa. And the colonization movement was very popular among even people like Abraham Lincoln. And that's where, if I may quickly make a reference to kind of the ongoing conversations right now about birthright, is that the reason why it's important to emphasize that this right is a form of apology or restitution for the trampling of the humanity of African Americans. Is that um, for a long time it was believed that African Americans did not belong in the United States. It was enough to give them metaphysical equality, but they were never to be seen as civil and social equals. And so the birthright was a way of recognizing that humanity and recognizing again against the Greco-Roman idea. The idea is that only proper humans were able to be citizens of Athenia, for example. And so again, I think this criticism of America is very piercing. But I think it must be said that there has been a lot of progress on this front. And nowadays, I mean, for example, the current sitting Supreme Court judge, Clarence Thomas, I happened to fall upon a late 1990s Washington Post article about his marriage, and a passing comment in that article was from a relative of his wife who said, "Well, he's very well spoken and friendly for a black guy," and that was late 90s. Okay, so that tells you already that by that time you already had metaphysical equality, you had civil equality, but there was still a question about social equality by the late 1990s. And so the question for us is, where are we at this point? Are we at a point where all three kinds of equality have been affirmed, or are we at a point where, for some reason, um, we're kind of going back? And it's not simply about African Americans anymore. It's about other kinds of people. Are they a social equal? And also, I think one of the things about the Trump administration is that in their policies, they are very much undermining the radical idea of the revolution, which is that human beings, as human beings, again, are equal to one another. So the fact that someone comes from Guatemala or the fact that someone comes from El Salvador really does not matter in terms of their worth as a human being. And it's part of the American exceptionalism, as it was one conceived, that Americans affirm that reality. But with the Trump administration, that reality is being basically undermined. And so I think that's the question you raise about to what extent do we actually believe in these ideals is very relevant to what's going on right now.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's not an accident that one of Trump's very first executive orders was attacking birthright citizenship, right? Because this is so fundamental to equality in America, to guaranteeing that we can't have a permanent underclass in a legal sense, that everybody gets the rights of citizen if you're born here, and if your children are born here, they will be citizens. And there's no conditions or there's like a qualifier that's like if you're not subject to the laws, but set that aside. There's no real qualifiers about your race, about your religion, about your national origin. Everybody, if you're here, you're part of the community now, or at least your children will be. And so I think we're seeing Republicans try to crack open these old questions and say, well, yeah, we believe in equality, but equality for who, right? Which people are, the elite citizens who are like genuinely members of the political community, and who do we need to kick out, right? Who do we think are second-class citizens who don't deserve to be here, don't belong here, and should be subordinate or should be removed? Um, and they are, in that respect, they are also drawing on themes in American history, right? These darker events that we've talked a little bit about. Um, and I guess the question I kind of want to ask you is whether it's easy to see what's happening today as a political struggle. I'm occasionally tempted to see it as a religious struggle. That when we talk about the idea of America as a creedal nation, America as an idea, you can see a certain kinship with religious affiliation and religious organization, right? That it is by believing in a certain set of principles, of faith, if you will, that makes you a member of that religion, and on certain readings, that makes you an American. And you can see other religious aspects to American nationalism, right? There's a reason that you can talk about American saints, right? Whether that's the founding fathers or Abraham Lincoln or Martin Luther King, people who people say, oh yeah, of course, a saint, right? We talk about American scripture in terms of the founding documents, and the way we
Right.
approach these and other documents often seems to be with a kind of religious awe. And even if you like, you can look at Washington, D.C., and especially the National Mall as kind of a temple complex. And
Yeah. Right.
the
Right.
tourists there, what they are doing is making a religious pilgrimage to sites of religious importance to affirm their participation in a kind of religious community. And
Hmm.
so that's a perspective on like what kind of a thing America is. But I think it also suggests that what we're in the middle of is a kind of a religious struggle, right?
Hmm.
Between, two schisms or two sects of the American religion that look at our history, that look at our founding documents, and have quite different interpretations of
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what you think about that perspective on our history and on our contemporary politics.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right. I think religion is fundamental to the American orientation, um, in terms of thinking, in terms of living. Um, and one of the things that's very striking to me about the current administration is how fundamentally irreligious it is, and specifically how unchristian in many ways. Um, and I see this often when uh, one is discussing again this idea of how to treat people as people. You can get into high level discussions about different ways to approach, you know, perennial problems. But there is a way in which one should approach human beings with a certain level of mm, uh, religious sacredness, which I think has been imbibed. I think for the most part by all kinds of people. One doesn't only actually need to be um, uh, confessing believer of any kind of religion to actually see that a lot of the human rights revolution and the way we talk about rights, um, you know, it assumes that people have very much taken in some of these religious assumptions, right? Um, and I was talking to a friend, and we were talking about this immigration crackdown. And there was one particular case where I think a video went viral where a number of agents uh, tried to, well, they succeeded in arresting this lady, a Muslim lady, wearing a hijab. And I was very moved by that because I thought to myself, uh, if you have a religious sensibility, then you basically have this understanding that um, certain religious norms and behaviors are important to people. So for Muslim women, you don't just walk up to them and touch them and grope them anyhow, right? Because there are certain kinds of expectations that are there. And if I know that, I'm not sending especially two burly men to arrest this woman. I might send, instead of men, I might send some qualified women officers, for example, to engage with this woman. But it showed to me that they had no consideration for what that lady's religious practices and expectations were. They just, they had a particular order and they sent it out. And you can see as well the different kind of inhumanity when it comes to charitable services, whether domestically or internationally, being able to cut funds for aid, or even one thing that's also very popular in right wing circles is a lot of this obsession with IQ. There's that for some reason the Haitians or any other group is kind of low IQ people, and because they are low IQ people, they're somehow going to impoverish whatever area of the United States they happen to land on. And again, that's why I often like to bring up this lock-in idea of equality, because it really bypasses this whole discussion about IQ. For John Locke, the religious ideas of John Locke again says that it's hard to even think that a Haitian doesn't have basic abstractive thinking. You know, um, and insofar as that's the minimal basis for moral consideration, the whole conversation about IQ does not even enter. And so I think if you have a religious conception of equality, um, then certain kinds of conversations that are happening on the right don't even emerge in the first place. And so I think uh, it's a religious struggle, but it's also a religious crisis. Um, and sometimes people wonder why younger generations, Gen Zs, are reporting lower attendance at church. And a lot of the conversations that you have with Gen Zs are not because they necessarily are close to there being some, greater being or whatever, or even that they think necessarily that uh, uh, religious organizations have no role to play in society. It's really by observing the behavior of people in power who claim the mantle of Christianity, that people start to be dejected and think to themselves, if this is what Christianity looks like, um, I really don't have much of an interest in that. And so uh, that is a problem if you are a minister of any kind in the United States. It is that it creates a certain reputation for Christians and Christian thinking and Christian tradition, that is going to be very hard to unwind if this administration continues to, pursue practices that are outrageous for ordinary, decent people. Especially now on social media, where people are displaying cages and uh, being very exuberant about the fact that they are finding means to imprison people. All of this kind of showmanship and sensationalism attached to being inhumane makes it very hard for people not to notice these kinds of inconsistencies. And so I think one thing that perhaps needs to be brought back is a conversation about this religious foundation of the United States, and specifically this very radical idea of natural equality. Um, one way I was thinking about it is, if you have, for example, a religious conception of humanity, you are going to be hesitant to say that donating money towards the poor or someone who is suffering um, is something that is not useful, or something that is not worthwhile, or something that is not worth suffering in different ways in order to accomplish. But also, you are going to be more limited in your claims about what exactly you're doing. So, for example, people nowadays look at charitable giving in terms of giving people humanity. So sometimes you see a brochure that says, look at this person in Africa. Thanks to our generous giving, we've given them humanity, the dignity for the very first time in their life. And if you have a religious conception of humanity, you would say, I understand the idea behind this suggestion, but it is confused, because what you do when you actually give people money is that you don't actually give them a new property called dignity. What you end up actually doing is affirming a property which they already have, which is dignity, by virtue of being human beings created in an image of God. And so I think that's a very different way of seeing human beings, and it's a way that's challenging to the current administration. I think because the current administration thinks that what makes you worthy of moral consideration is your belonging to some sort of very specifically defined conception of the nation, rather than you being a human being just as a human being. And so, yeah, I think that is the religious challenge that we have, and I think what philosophers, historians, academics in general have to do is find a way of making people understand this and renew their commitment to this idea of equality um, in ways that make sense to a secular society, um, and in a way that actually enables people to resist the encroachment from people in the current administration.
Yeah, I think there's on certain parts of the left, you see this kind of allergy to talking in these terms. People who want to say, well, actually, the only history of America is a history of exploitation, is a history of oppression, is a history of racial hierarchy. That's the real truth that's hidden behind all these lies about equality. And on some level, what we're seeing is people like Vance, people like Trump say, like, yeah, that's right. And
Yeah,
it's good,
yeah,
right? Right. It is all oppression, and it is us versus them, and like we
yeah,
choose us, and we're gonna oppress them, and that'll be good for us.
yeah,
And I
yeah,
think I think, for those of us who are against that kind of thing, we have to learn to and be able to speak to these deeper aspirations of people, whether those are religious or those are secular or those have some other basis, but to speak to this idea of fundamental human equality, to
That's
our
right.
inalienable rights to, again, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness,
Yeah.
because
Mhm.
these ideas do matter and they do
Yeah.
move people, and they have moved
That's right.
people throughout American history. And that doesn't mean that they've always been perfectly instantiated and they've always been with us in their perfect form, but this is a cause and a project that is ongoing. And I
Yeah.
think we need to be able to speak to those values on a deep level in a way that Republicans are very much speaking to their own base about their own opposed ideas. They are totally willing to work in this deep register about answering this question: what is America? And we
Hmm.
have to do the same.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Guillaume, thank you so much for coming on and having some of these deeper conversations. It was a pleasure
Yeah.
having you.
Thank you very much, and I'm so glad you brought us so many of the underlying issues that were behind my essay, and I think the final discussion is very much something that can be a cause for good strategy and going forward. For I think doesn't matter what kind of uh, party you actually end up identifying with, what kind of orientation, whether you're a socialist or a liberal, or I think there's fundamental values, that kind of American values that can really motivate people to resist some of the things that we're seeing right now. So thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. And once again, thank you all for listening.